Now, FBI Director Christopher Wray has warned Congress that Hamas's terror attacks on Israel could motivate threats similar to past ISIS threats, although there's no immediate indication of Hamas conducting such attacks. And for more on this, Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, Professor of Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, joins us in the studio. Well, Professor, thanks for being here with us today. Help us understand a little bit about the current threat landscape in the U.S. How does that compare to, say, previous periods when there was also, like heightened terrorism concerns?
World has witnessed two waves of global terrorism. One is Al-Qaeda, the group that did the 9/11 attack. Second is ISIS, the group that dominated the threat landscape out of Syria and Iraq. But more than 60,000 fighters came and joined. They started to do attacks around the world. So first wave is Al-Qaeda, second wave is ISIS. The security and intelligence services today, they are very concerned due to the developments in Gaza, whether this will galvanize those extremist organizations to mount attacks on behalf of Hamas. So we have also seen calls by Al-Qaeda and ISIS asking their supporters to go and attack US targets, European targets, Israeli targets, and Jewish targets. So it's very likely that the world will witness a third wave of global terrorism.
And that is a frightening thought. Although the FBI director, he did say at this point, Hamas doesn't currently, have the intent or the capability to conduct such attacks in the U.S. But as you've mentioned, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they've already called, basically, they've issued calls to action. So do you think that this is something that should be, taken more seriously? That there are also concerns of lone wolf attacks, for instance.
Governments around the world will have to work not in cooperation, but in collaboration and partnership, meaning working very closely each other, sharing information and intelligence, and even do joint operations to ensure that there are no attacks taking place. Because if there are attacks, certainly it will motivate other attacks. And as you said, these attacks are not only by well-structured groups, but unstructured networks by individuals. So even lone wolf attacks. So what is key is that during this period, governments will have to work together as one to ensure that there is no inspiration and no instigation, so that the global threat of terrorism will once again a huge challenge, like in the past, like after Al-Qaeda did 9/11, after ISIS did so many attacks, a third wave does not emerge.
Right. And also just closer to home, we've seen all the protesters, coming out and expressing their support for Palestine. We're talking about Indonesia, Malaysia. In terms of the level of threat in Southeast Asia at this current moment, what's your assessment?
In Singapore's immediate neighborhood, we have two types of groups. One is those groups inspired and instigated and supported by Al-Qaeda, groups like Jamaah Islamiyah. Then the groups that are inspired and influenced and directed by ISIS. These groups are still very much active, and governments in this region are constantly fighting. For example, the Indonesian government, the Malaysian government, the Filipino government, they are constantly fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS cells. So these governments have also shared information and intelligence, prevented so many attacks, including Singapore. So that is why the public must be alert during this period. Not only governments, we need to raise what is called specialist awareness within governments, but we also need public awareness, so that if people are vigilant and alert during this time, then no successful attack can take place.
Now I want to touch on Iran and Hezbollah's threat. How do they factor in this current landscape? Especially when we're talking about attacks now, there's cyber, there's kinetic attacks, which basically means targeting vulnerable systems, computer systems.
Iran is a principal supporter of Lebanese Hezbollah, which is public information. Other than that, a group called Ansarullah in Yemen, which is the Houthi movement. And these groups are also calling for attacks against Israel and against Jewish targets. So we are seeing for the first time both Sunni groups, that is Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as well as Shia groups having a common goal. Ideologically, they are different. But at this point, they have come together. That is why I believe that the current threat landscape is quite serious, and that is why both the FBI director and the British security chief, he mentioned of the likelihood of terrorist attacks because they have reviewed the threat landscape, they have studied the intentions and the capabilities of these groups, and they believe that unless people are vigilant, unless governments take preemptive action and we are able to prevent these attacks, then the world will witness.
You mentioned that, I mean, you know, it must be cross-border cooperation, transboundary cooperation, and how can that actually aid in terms of, you know, we talk about cryptocurrency, we talk about terrorist funding, with involvement of, you know, like say crypto in financing these terrorist organizations like Hamas. How do we trace? How do the countries work together to disrupt and cut off the financial support networks?
They have to do 5 things. One is exchange personnel between countries, also between law enforcement, military and intelligence. Second is have common databases. Third is have joint training, joint operations, sharing of information and resources, as well as sharing experience. So these are the formats, the different...
Is it happening now, or it's still not quite up to the level that needs to happen?
It happens to some extent, but it mostly happens between the 5 Eyes countries, the Australia, Canada, UK, US, New Zealand. I believe that this level of threat is such that governments will have to share information across those ideological blocks so that we can prevent attacks. With regard to finances, yes, what you raised is so important because if we can trace the money, we can prevent attacks. So terrorists are using both cryptos and the money that everyone uses. And what I want to say is that it's very difficult to trace the digital currencies. But I believe that if we try hard and if we get the best people to staff those key national security institutions, we are able to trace the money. And if we can trace the money, we can certainly prevent attacks. There was a huge failure in policymaking and intelligence when it came to the Hamas attack on October 7th. But I believe that this is a very important lesson. And if the governments around the world learn the right lessons from that huge catastrophic attack, huge tragedy, then we will be able to prevent such attacks.
So, you know, Professor Rohan, I mean, not a lot of people might know this, but you have actually met with 6 of the heads of the Mossad since your first visit to Israel back in 1999. And as you know, there are growing calls now for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to step down. Do you agree with these growing calls that will at least help with his resignation, that will help to move them a step closer to resolution?
I believe that Israel should do 2 things. One is it should get their hostages out. And for this, they should work with their partners, especially in the Muslim world, to get Hamas to release the people they have taken as hostages. Second is they should be more precise and more targeted in their operations. If there are huge civilian fatalities and casualties, the operations that the Israelis are mounting will not be sustainable. And it will also lead to more support from elements in the Muslim society, the fringes of Muslim society towards extremist organizations. So I believe that the humanitarian component is as important as the lethal and the kinetic operations that must be mounted against terrorist groups. You need both the left and the right hand.
So, Professor Rohan, you didn't quite answer my question directly, but just yes or no, do you think that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should resign?
He should, because of a reason. Because this attack happened during this period. And I personally believe that, I have met with him previously, but I personally believe that there should be a government that has more broad-based and wider support in Israel to conduct their operations and to also to create a two-state solution. You can't have a prime minister who doesn't enjoy that broad-based support to progress. So it's a question of time that he will be replaced.
Well, thanks very much for your frank assessment and insights. Professor Rohan Gunaratna there was speaking to his Professor of Security Studies from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.